Welcome in, everybody. We're diving deep today into U.S. tariffs. You guys sent a ton of articles and analysis on this, so let's get into it. Tariffs are always in the news. They're supposed to protect American businesses and jobs, but they can also make things more expensive for everyone. It's complicated.
Yeah, it's definitely not a simple issue. To really understand tariffs, we have to look at how they work and also look back at how they've been used historically.
Okay, cool. But before we go too deep, let's start with the basics. What exactly are tariffs, and how do they work?
Well, a tariff is basically a tax on stuff brought in from another country. Companies here in the US often want these tariffs because they think it'll protect them from competition overseas. But, and this is important, the importer is the one who actually pays the tariff. And
Hmm.
often that cost gets passed along until it hits the consumer, with a higher price tag.
So this isn't just about big economic theories. It actually affects what we pay for stuff every day.
Exactly. Think about the tariffs on steel and aluminum a while back. Those tariffs made it more expensive to produce a bunch of things. Cars, washing machines, you name it. And those higher costs get passed on to people buying that stuff.
That makes sense. But I'm curious, have tariffs always been about protecting American companies?
It's interesting. Before we had income taxes, tariffs were one of the main ways the government got money.
Really? I had no idea. That's a huge shift from being a way to raise money to being a tool to protect industries.
It is. After World War II, there was a big push for free trade all over the world. And a lot of countries, including the US, lowered tariffs to encourage more trade between countries. But as things changed, people started getting worried about trade deficits and losing jobs. That led to a comeback for protectionist ideas, and tariffs started being used more strategically again.
So it sounds like there's this back and forth between free trade and protectionism. But let's talk about what's happened recently. All the stuff you sent me focuses a lot on how the Trump administration used tariffs.
Yeah, the Trump administration put tariffs on a lot of goods from countries like Mexico, Canada, and especially China. They wanted to fix the trade deficit and boost American manufacturing, but it ended up causing these trade wars with other countries, and that had some serious consequences for the global market and international relations.
So it wasn't just a matter of putting tariffs in place and that's it. There was this whole chain reaction of everyone responding and then responding again.
Exactly. Like take Mexico, for example.
Yeah.
To avoid the tariffs on Mexican goods, their government agreed to send 10,000 troops to their northern border. It was to try to stop drug trafficking. It shows how tariffs can be used to force countries to do things to avoid those economic penalties.
Wow, that's a pretty powerful example of how tariffs can be used as leverage.
Right. And Canada also hit back pretty hard at the U.S. tariffs. They put their own tariffs on $155 billion worth of U.S. goods. They targeted industries that would really feel it, ketchup producers, playing card companies, things like that.
So it seems like everyone was trying to look out for their own interests, and that just made things worse. What about China? What did they do about the U.S. tariff?
China was pretty strategic. They put tariffs on some key U.S. exports like coal, crude oil, and farm equipment. Those are all industries that are really important politically. They knew it would put pressure on the U.S. government.
So it wasn't just about doing the same thing back to the U.S. They actually put some thought into it. So what happened when Biden took office? Did he keep using tariffs the same way?
The Biden administration's been a little more careful. They kept some of the tariffs from the Trump era, but they've also put new ones in place, especially on things like electric vehicles. And there's been some debate about whether these new tariffs are actually hurting innovation and competition in the EV market.
Yeah, that's interesting. Biden's been pushing for green energy, but then he's also using tariffs on electric vehicles.
Yeah, it's kind of tricky. On the one hand, they want to encourage companies here to make more EVs, which goes along with their green energy goals. But on the other hand, putting tariffs on important parts like EV batteries, which mostly come from China, can make production more expensive. And that might actually slow down innovation and competition.
So it's like they're trying to walk this tightrope between helping a new industry grow and protecting American companies. It seems like tariffs aren't as simple as they might seem. They have all these other effects.
That's exactly right. We need to look past this idea of tariffs just being about protecting certain industries. We need to think about all the different consequences they can have, both here and around the world.
Okay, so we've talked about how tariffs have been used throughout history, and we've looked at the complicated situation with the recent trade wars. Now let's focus on how all this affects the U.S. economy. You mentioned earlier that tariffs can make prices go up for consumers. Can you give some specific examples of how this has played out in different areas, and how has it affected people's wallets?
Sure. Let's look at consumer goods. A lot of those products come from China. The tariffs on Chinese goods have made a lot of things more expensive. Electronics, clothes, furniture, even appliances. It's like a tax on consumers, especially people with lower incomes. They're the ones who are hit hardest when prices go up.
So it's not just some abstract economic thing. These tariffs directly affect what people have to pay for the things they need every day. It's like a hidden tax that hurts the people who can least afford it.
That's really important to remember. It's easy to get caught up in all the talk about trade deficits and competition between industries, but we have to remember that these policies actually affect individual people.
And I bet the stock market reacted pretty strongly to all of this. I mean, it's always sensitive to economic uncertainty.
Yeah, you're right.
When those tariffs were first announced, markets all over the world went down.
Investors don't like uncertainty. And the possibility of these trade disputes dragging on and causing instability made things really volatile.
So tariffs don't just affect specific industries. They can affect the entire financial landscape. What about long-standing trade agreements? Have those been affected by all these tariffs?
Definitely. Agreements like the USMCA, that's the one between the US, Mexico, and Canada, are supposed to encourage free trade and cooperation. But all these tariff disputes have made things tense. It creates this atmosphere of mistrust and makes it harder to negotiate and work together on trade issues.
So it's not just about the economic numbers, it's about the potential damage to these important relationships between countries.
Exactly. These agreements rely on the idea that everyone benefits and that everyone's working together. But when one country starts using protectionist measures like tariffs, it undermines that whole idea. And it can lead to a more adversarial relationship.
It sounds like dealing with tariffs is like trying to walk a tightrope. You're trying to balance the needs of American companies with this complex global economy.
It really is a complex issue with a lot of different factors. And we've only just scratched the surface. To really understand the impact of U.S. tariff policy, we need to look more closely at the arguments for and against them. We need to see how they affect specific industries. And we need to examine the long-term consequences for global trade and economic stability.
You've definitely got me thinking. I'm really interested to keep exploring this. Let's dive into those different perspectives and see what we can learn. Okay, so we've talked about how tariffs can be this balancing act with lots of potential for things to go wrong. But let's get into the arguments people make for and against them. I'm sure there are strong opinions on both sides.
Oh, yeah, definitely. People who like tariffs usually talk about protecting American industries from competition from other countries that they see as unfair. They say tariffs can make things more even, create jobs here, and shrink the trade deficit.
So it's about that Buy American idea.
Exactly. The idea is that if imported goods are more expensive, people will buy more American-made stuff, and that helps our manufacturing and creates more jobs here.
But wouldn't people argue that that ends up costing consumers more? I mean, if tariffs make prices go up, isn't that bad for regular people buying things?
That's a big part of the debate. People who don't like tariffs say they make prices higher for everyone. Like, let's say you're buying a new laptop. A tariff on computer parts that are imported would make that laptop more expensive, harder to afford. And it's not just electronics, it's everything, clothes, furniture, groceries. It hits people with less money the hardest because they can't afford those price increases.
And I think I remember some of the research you sent mentioned something about tariffs messing up global supply chains.
Right. They can really disrupt those complicated supply chains that we depend on. Think about making a smartphone. All those parts come from different countries, get put together somewhere else, and then get shipped all over the world. Tariffs can mess that whole system up. You get shortages, delays, and higher costs for companies, and those usually get passed on to the customer.
So it's not just a small price increase. It could be a lot of disruption and instability in the whole market. Can we shift gears a bit and talk about how tariffs affect particular industries? The research focused a lot on agriculture and the auto industry as being really vulnerable to these trade wars.
Yeah, you're right. Those industries were hit hard. American farmers especially got hurt by other countries putting tariffs on their exports. Soybean farmers who sell a lot of their crops to China saw demand go way down and really struggled financially.
And the government ended up spending billions of dollars to help them with subsidies.
Yeah, but subsidies are just a temporary fix. They don't fix the trade problems, and they can distort the market.
And how about the auto industry? How did tariffs affect them?
Well, tariffs on steel and aluminum, which are crucial for making cars, made it more expensive to produce cars. And that meant higher prices for both car companies and people buying cars. Imagine a family trying to buy a new car. A tariff that raises the price might make it impossible to buy that car, and they have to wait or get a cheaper, maybe less safe car.
Wow, you really see how these tariffs have a domino effect.
Yeah.
They don't just affect companies and industries, they affect regular people and families trying to buy things.
Exactly, and that's a really important point. We have to think about all the consequences of these policies, not just the ones people intend, but the unexpected ones too. There's another part of this we haven't talked about: currency.
Right, that part always seemed a little confusing to me. How do tariffs affect what the US dollar is worth, and how does that impact international trade?
It's actually pretty interesting. When tariffs make things from other countries more expensive, people might buy less of those goods. And that can mean less demand for the currencies you need to buy those goods. At the same time, if tariffs make American goods look better, the demand for US dollars might go up. And that can lead to the dollar being worth more compared to other currencies.
So a stronger dollar seems like a good thing, right? Our money is worth more.
Well, not always. A strong US dollar can actually make things we export more expensive for people in other countries, which hurts American companies that sell their products overseas. Let's say there's a company here selling tractors in Europe. A strong dollar means those tractors are more expensive for European farmers, so they're not as competitive compared to tractors made in Europe or other places where the currency is weaker.
So it's another one of those situations where you have to be really careful. A strong dollar might sound good at first, but it can cause problems for American businesses trying to compete globally.
You got it. It shows how connected the global economy is and how a policy decision that seems simple can have effects all over the world.
It's crazy to think about all these different moving parts and all the cause and effect relationships. It shows why you need to really understand these issues before you make decisions that could affect so many people and businesses.
I totally agree. When you really look at tariffs closely, you see how domestic policy, global trade, and the financial well-being of people and businesses are all connected.
You've definitely helped explain some key parts of this complex issue. Before we finish up, I want to make sure we highlight the main takeaways for our listeners.
Yeah.
What are the big picture things we should all remember about U.S. tariff policy?
Well, I think the biggest thing to remember is that tariffs can be good and bad. They can protect industries here in the US, but they can also cause problems like higher prices for consumers, disruptions in those global supply chains we talked about, and other countries retaliating with their own tariffs.
Yeah, it seems like you're trying to solve one problem and end up creating a bunch of new ones. It makes you wonder if there are other ways to fix these trade imbalances and protect American businesses without using tariffs.
You're right, and that's something policymakers are always trying to figure out. How do we create fair competition and help the economy grow without resorting to protectionism, which can actually hurt everyone in the end? It's a tough question, and there are no easy answers.
You've given us a lot to think about. Before we go, do you have one last question to leave our listeners with? Something that will get them thinking about U.S. tariff policy.
I think the most important question is this. Knowing that tariffs can have long-term effects on the economy and could even destabilize things globally, are there other solutions we could try to fix trade imbalances and support American industries? Can we find ways to encourage fair trade and cooperation while making sure American companies and workers can compete in the global market?
That's a great question, and I hope our listeners will keep thinking about it. There are no easy answers, but if we have these conversations and really try to understand all sides of the issue, we can hopefully find a way forward that benefits both the U.S. and the rest of the world.
I agree. It's all about talking to each other, being willing to see things from different perspectives, and working together to find solutions that help everyone.
Well said. Thank you so much for talking with us today. It's been really insightful.
I enjoyed it. It's always good to talk about these important issues and hopefully get people thinking.
And to our listeners, thank you for joining us as we explored this complex world of U.S. tariffs. We encourage you to keep learning about it, dive deeper into the research, and form your own opinions. Until next time, keep those brains working.